This lesson takes up the question of what a board should know about parliamentary procedure. And this is probably the longest of the lectures we have, but it comes with a promise that if you watch this entire video, you will know everything you need to know about parliamentary procedure for a board meeting. This is an issue that we enjoy talking about since the percentage of nonprofit organizations that we're acquainted with, and we've attended the board meetings of well over 500 organizations, is pretty close to 100% failure rate. And so even though this is the longest of our lessons in the series, I am confident that after you watching this video, you'll have mastered parliamentary procedure for boards and will be performing far in excess of how other organizations do. The key authority that most organizations refer to when talking about parliamentary procedure is Roberts. And some don't know that it's actually a book, but I just happen to have and always have next to me in my office, both here and at home, a copy of this. It's 649 pages of rules, and we can provide you in just a few minutes with everything you need to know to operate as a board in most meetings in this lesson. Roberts was first published in 1876 in February of that year, so it's now well over 150 years old. It's revised about once every 10 years, and the current edition, this one, is the 12th edition, published in 2020. If I can nerd out a little bit on this, the name of this volume and the last several is Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. And that is the name that has been used on it since the edition that came out in 1970. That was the 7th edition. The last time the name that was used on the volume was just called Robert's Rules of Order was in 1893. And even that was just the short title on the cover of the 3rd edition. There's actually a much longer, cumbersome name that was used in those publications. And the reason I point this out is that some bylaws for nonprofit organizations state that the parliamentary authority used by the organization is Robert's Rules of Order. Now, in litigation, that can become an issue since the last time a book was published with that name was in 1893. A party that could benefit from citing that volume, because the bylaws just mentioned Robert's Rules of Order, is actually pretty compelling. We recommend not having that be crowded. One problem with the 1893 edition is that it really does not address notification by email or SMS, and it doesn't make any mention of whether you can attend a board meeting by Zoom. So what we recommend doing in minutes is to refer to the latest edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. Right now, that would refer to this, and when a new edition comes out, which will probably be in 2030, you don't need to amend the bylaws. That would just simply take care of it. Now, our experience is that what most people think they know about parliamentary procedure, they learned when they were on their junior high student council. And the instructor there may very well have been somebody with no background. It could be an athletic coach that's partly fulfilling his or her extracurricular expectations of teachers. And that coach learned everything he or she knew from back when he or she was on junior high student council some 30 years earlier. So there's a tremendous amount of misinformation about what it takes to carry out the voluminous requirements of this when a meeting is taking place for a board. And of course, we've got to start with that most relevant question of all. How do you handle seconds to motions? The big haunting question in operation of a board. When do you need a second to a motion? The answer to that very simply is never. That's expressly stated in Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, latest edition, at Rule 49.21.2. That rule states very, very clearly that in boards of no more than approximately 12, motions need not be seconded. The logic of the need for a second is in for large bodies like a parliament, where the principle of parliamentary procedure was designed. The idea was that in a large body, anytime a motion is on the table, the organization has to undertake all the discussion that people may want to offer until such a time as somebody calls the question for a vote. In light of that, you don't want somebody wasting everyone's time by bringing a private axe to grind without having at least somebody else in the assembly vouch for the fact that this is worthy of discussion. That is logical in a large group. It makes no sense when in a group of, as Roberts puts it, approximately 12. And there's an even further reason why you should never want to have a second in a motion brought before a board. And that is, as we've covered in earlier lessons, you as a board member have a fiduciary duty to care. To carry out the duty of care, you cannot tell another board member who says, I have something I want us to discuss, to say, no, you may not speak until somebody else vouches for you. There is an absolute obligation when you are serving on a board to hear what others have to say. Now, this is probably less of a problem than I'm describing it, since I don't know of any instance in any board meeting I ever attended, and I have spent hundreds of hours of board meetings, where anybody has ever brought a motion that did not get a second. That also tends to show just how trivial that idea of seconding is. But forget the lessons you learned in junior high student council. When you are in a board meeting, you do not need a second. Now, I would modify a little bit. This is not contradicting Roberts, which I revere, but something that is a significant point is Roberts just addresses how meetings are conducted. It does not address fiduciary duties. It was designed primarily for large bodies where the members don't have a fiduciary duty. They can act entirely selfishly. In fact, even in representative governments, they're not looking for the best of the entire organization many times. They're looking for what's best for their constituents. It's not a fiduciary duty. In a board, there's always a fiduciary obligation. And as a result, even if approximately 12 is interpreted as, well, as up to 25, if there are that many people on the board, I would hold to the same principle that you should not, and actually from a fiduciary duty of care, cannot mandate a second before a matter is considered. As an aside, generally speaking, boards of more than about 12 people tend to not be very efficient. You have directors who simply aren't engaged because there's too many people. But there are some exceptions in some industries. For example, university boards tend to be large for a variety of reasons having to do with governance and fundraising on boards. So they are there, but I would not say that the best interpretation of Roberts is that when a board has more than 12 people, or more than approximately 12 people, that there is an obligation to get a second to a motion before a matter is considered. There's still the fiduciary duty to hear what the people have to say. Second point where there is the largest misunderstanding is a perception that the chair of the board cannot make a motion. And you see this usually played out by meetings where the board chair will clearly explain what the motion is and then ask, will somebody make that motion? And somebody shouts out, so moved, two very uninformative words. The confusion is that in large assemblies, going back to the market for which Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, and earlier editions were created, was to make sure that those chairing a large assembly are impartial. You pick somebody to run the meeting there, not so that they can lobby the crowd to go their direction. You want them to stand back and be impartial and not even vote unless it's necessary to break a tie. But very often those chairing large assemblies don't have voting power anyway. A board is different in that the board chair has a fiduciary duty of care just like anybody else. The chair should not remain silent when the chair has something useful to say that addresses the issue. And that can include making the motion. So it's bizarre to have this so moved moment when something's being considered. The important thing is to make sure it's very clear what the motion is. And in most instances, that's going to be the most clear if it's printed out ahead of time. And that is the motion. And it can be considered, discussion can take place, and then the matter is voted on. It doesn't need the chair to plead with somebody else to utter the words so moved, and it doesn't need a second. Just address that issue which is before the body, have discussion so it's very clear that everybody is sounded out, and once that has taken place, you move on and have the vote. On the issue of writing out motions, it is extremely common in the board setting in particular for people to know what the issues are that need to be addressed. Approving a budget, considering whether to hire somebody whose CV and resume have been distributed ahead of time, approving the budget, determining whether a building should be sold. It's pretty clear what the issue is going to be. Having it in writing just makes a lot of sense. Many times you can ask those who provide reports to include in their written report a proposed motion to be considered. That doesn't make it a motion if it is from the officer that is not a part of the board who wrote the report, but it's pretty easy to understand what the issue is. And all the chair of the board needs to say is, we will now take up the proposed motion that's in page 2 of the finance director's report. That puts the matter at issue before the body, and it can be considered. There's no need to have all these kind of theatrics going on whether this has been properly presented or not. And writing up motions makes a lot of sense. Two places where they can be written out. One, as we just talked about, in reports, but also for those motions to be considered that the chair knows that needs to be taken up, but there isn't a report mentioning it. Just print that in the agenda item. When you list the agenda, point 1 is resolution to sell the property on Main Street. And that makes it very, very clear if the agenda is sent out before the meeting that those on the board can consider the issues. They can call up other board members and get insight before the meeting comes up. And the issue is well known. There's no reason to surprise everybody at the last minute by orally presenting a motion that could easily have been given in writing earlier on. Then all the chair needs to do is say, we'll take up item 7 on the agenda, which is a motion 2, and then either describes it, or if it's short, we can just read that part. But the significant part is the motion is that which was distributed unless it's amended by the group that's together. And those amendments are very, very common. You could have a motion that says we would like to approve the sale of property in downtown by the end of December. And at the meeting, somebody says, I'd like to amend that motion to make it not until after January 1st, since we want to keep that off of our books because of our finances this year. And the chair can then say, any discussion on that amendment? If everyone is agreeable with that, then the motion as written is amended to read, and then read it with a changed date. Then you have your discussion. When it's clear there's no more discussion, the chair can call the question and it's voted, and the way that the vote comes out determines whether this is a resolution adopted by the board or not. That is all that you need to know about how to use the rules of parliamentary procedure in a board meeting. And these are all carefully described in Robert's Rules of Order. In fact, if you want a specific reference, Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised 12th edition, rules 4.4 and 4.5 address that very issue about motions being written down, and how the chair does not need to read it if it is written down in that manner. At the end of a meeting, there is a similar kind of motion brought up that is totally needless, and that is the motion to adjourn. One can assume that if the chair asks, is there any other business, and everyone is silent, that there would be no reason to bring a motion to adjourn. The odds that when there's no more business, that you would get even one person saying, I object to adjourning, is virtually impossible. It'd be weird to do so. So when business is done, if it's clear nobody has any further business to bring forward, just end the meeting. I attended a meeting once where the chair sat at the front of the table and said, I will entertain a motion to begin the meeting, which is weird because if the meeting isn't in session, they can't consider any motions. So you would never get a meeting to start if that was a rule to follow. My best recommendation is ignore all that junior high student council stuff and just get down to the kinds of things that need to be done. With that, you have heard everything you need to know about how to conduct a meeting following the latest edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. By the way, there's several different written forms of parliamentary procedure. There are two that dominate, and Roberts is the more dominant of those, but both of them are in agreement on how these are handled, that managing board meetings, because they're small, are handled in one way. And I add the extra layer that because as a director, you have a fiduciary duty to consider all the issues that can be presented, that you're actually violating Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, and other authorities by saying that a matter will not be considered without having a second person vouch for it. So one other area to address, just because this is a bit of a tirade on some of the crazy stuff that happens at meetings that need not happen, is you will frequently find after somebody has given a report, particularly one that has been distributed, that the chair will say, I will entertain a motion to receive the report. But receiving a report means to hear it. That's kind of obvious, and it's also expressly mentioned in Robert's Rule of Order, newly revised, 12th edition, at Rule 51.9, that receiving a report means you're hearing it. So once somebody has delivered a report, you can't undo what you heard by voting against the reception of the report. I think the confusion comes from the fact that sometimes an issue is reported to a board like a policy that the board would like to adopt. But if you want to adopt a policy, you're not receiving a report, you're adopting a policy or adopting the report. An example of that would be if, due to difficulties in an organization's membership, a decision is made to consider whether we ought to deny membership to those who live out of state. You could have somebody in the organization give a lengthy report on how our experience with those that don't live in the state is they generally don't participate, they don't give it a high number, they take a lot, and evidence is that the organization would be stronger if we did not have out-of-state members for all these reasons. Well, once that report has been given, it's been received, but it's very possible that the board might want to have the staff know that this is now the formal policy of the board and is an explanation that can be given to an applicant who lives out of state on why their application is not going to be accepted. In that case, the fact that the board has adopted the report can be useful. Those situations happen very, very rarely. Probably in religious organizations, they come up more often than in secular ones, but it's not very often that you need to have the board actually adopt a report that has been given. The board directors have no way of proving or disproving something that has been given to them where they've done no background research. They're taking the word of those that they trust who gave the report to give it accurately, but they can't make it accurate by the fact that they voted in some way to show that they've received it. So with that, we've covered all of the kinds of things that happen while the meeting is in session. I do want to have one last comment on minutes, because there's also a problem with minutes where these also tend to follow practices that may have been learned during junior high student council. Minutes do not need to be long for most organizations, but there are exceptions. But for most organizations, they can run about a page and a half at most. What they should indicate is the date, because you want to be able to identify the sequence for the minutes. And they should mention who was there, both directors on the board who are there, guests as well, can be useful information to have, and list the directors who are not there. And then there can be a comment, although it's obvious from what's written above that there's a quorum. That's just useful information to have because directors come and go during meetings. It is useful to indicate the sequence of motions considered if at some point a director came or a director left. And sometimes the directors want that information to make it very, very clear that they didn't or did vote on a motion. And speaking of motions, it's also kind of silly to, after asking for raising of hands of those who voted yes and a raising of hands for those who vote no, to ask for a vote by those who abstain. It seems pretty obvious who abstained by the fact that they never raised their hand. It's just a silly kind of practice, again, junior high student council, to think that you've got to somehow record, somehow you've got to get everybody to raise their hand at some point in the meeting. But during the minutes, all you really need is to indicate the exact language of the motion as amended, if it was amended, and then indicate whether it passed or not. You do not need to record who brought the motion. You don't need to indicate who's second, because you don't want to shame them for having seconded it in the first place. And you just need to indicate that it was approved. I'm surprised how many, many times we review the records of clients and see that they will put down in the minutes who moved, who seconded, and not actually indicate how the vote came out. And we know what causes that is pretty much every motion that's ever brought before the board is passed. So the minute taker just makes an assumption if a motion was brought, it passed. But even though that's always the case, you still got to identify the name of somebody who seconded it. But that's all nonsense. So just putting in the motion and the outcome of the vote is sufficient for most minutes. There is one exception that I do want to talk about a little bit. There are times when you want more context in the minutes because that can become an issue in litigation. For one thing, if it's a dodgy issue where there's some concern about personal liability, if a member of the body says, I would like my no vote to be identified in the minutes, by all means, the organization should allow that. So when the issue comes up on a motion on whether to open a project in an area where it's speculative about whether that's legally permitted there, the vote may pass, and the minutes could say what the motion is and say motion passed, member X requested that he or she be identified as having voted no. That's a courtesy to be granted to the person who wants it very, very clear that they're not responsible for the way that the vote came out. That happens rarely, but it's worth showing grace to the individual that wants to do that in that instance. There are also times when you want more data because the fact that the board considered something is critically important. For example, there is in the tax code protections for boards that consider very carefully by looking at comparable data in setting compensation for employees. In those instances, it would be reasonable to include, after stating the motion, the board deliberated for 20 minutes and considered the comparable data from 3 other similarly sized organizations and identify those organizations possibly and indicate because our president has a PhD and headed up a similar organization of much larger size previously, we set compensation at slightly higher than the average for organizations of this type. That could be very, very useful if litigation or audit comes up years later to have that kind of information there. But that's not common. It is useful on sensitive issues to put enough context there. And by all means, if a report is delivered that explains why an issue is taken up, just attach that report to the minutes. You don't need to summarize the report when the report itself exists and explains things very carefully. With that, we've covered a lot of ground, and this is, again, our longest lesson at almost half an hour, but the payoff is huge in that you now know everything you ever need to know about this marvelous book.